Hundreds condemned to death in Egypt with no evidence and no defense. Egyptian justice denounced as a gross violation of human rights. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Done and dusted in a matter of days. Hundreds of Egyptians have been sentenced to death for their role in the killing of a policeman. It is the largest mass death sentence anywhere in the world in recent years, drawing condemnation by rights groups as a violation of international law. A total of 1,200 people were collectively charged with murder following rioting in August. A statement by Human Rights Watch said it's shocking, even amid Egypt's deep political repression, that a court has sentenced people to death without giving them any meaningful opportunity to defend themselves. The Minya court failed to carry out its most fundamental duty to assess the individual guilt of each defendant, violating the most basic fair trial right. Egypt has come under increased pressure for its record on human rights in recent months, accused of a violent crackdown on political dissent. Hashim Akhabara has this report.
Relatives in shock. It's the largest number of people to be sentenced to death by a court in Egypt's history. The defendants, many of them supporters of the deposed president, Mohamed Morsi, were accused of killing one police officer, seizing government weapons and damaging property when a police station in the town of Matai, south of Cairo, was attacked. It happened last August. At the time, Egyptian security forces carried out raids on two large anti-military protest sites in Cairo. Hundreds of people were killed, leading to riots in other parts of the country. Defense lawyers said they had been given no time to review trial documents. They criticized the ruling of presiding judge Said Youssef.
We believe that the trial's fairness, which is a right enshrined in the criminal code, was absent in this case.
The verdict is seen as a sign of the government's widening crackdown on opposition voices, especially on members of the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. Most of the defendants are from Upper Egypt, a conservative tribal area where blood feuds run deep, raising concerns that this verdict could lead to further instability and violence in the country. Hashim Akhabara, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from our London studios is Nicolas Piachaud, North Africa campaigner for Amnesty International, and in New York, Frank Wisner, a former US ambassador to Egypt. Thank you very much for joining us. Nicolas, 529 people condemned to death. How on earth can this happen?
Well, this is an outrageous and unprecedented verdict. I've been documenting the death penalty in Egypt for many years, and I've never seen anything like this. Just to put these figures into context, this is the largest number of death sentences handed down in recent times, not just in Egypt, but anywhere in the world. I think we'll have to do a lot of digging in our files to find anything that matches this. This is a trial which has laid bare the selective nature and the serious shortcomings of Egypt's criminal justice system.
Talk us through what happened in the court, because there are a litany of mistakes, aren't there?
This was a grossly unfair trial which followed, a grossly unfair criminal process. Lawyers told us that they didn't have access to some of the defendants. Many of the defendants were actually sentenced in their absence, which means they're on the run or may not even know that they've been indicted in this case. The judge announced that he would deliver his verdict within 2 sessions, and he forbade the defense lawyers from reviewing the case file, which is a serious violation of international fair trial standards. And when the defense lawyers protested, he ordered armed security guards to surround them. This is a behavior which is more suitable for a show trial than a court of law.
Frank Wisner, you lived and worked in Egypt. knowing the country the way you do, the justice system. What is your response?
Well, I have obviously as many concerns as have just been voiced by the other speaker. This is a very troubling matter, and it's been openly discussed and condemned by the British and the United States governments. That said, I listened very carefully to the way this segment of the hour was set up, and also the overwrought press commentary, for it leads to two conclusions which I believe are wrong-headed. First, that this is a set of decisions teleguided by the political leadership in Egypt, while in fact these are a judicial set of decisions, and the Egyptian court system is still to play out the rest of the proceeding. There will be appeals, and we don't know what the end story will be. Second,
because, sorry, excuse me, jumping in here. I mean, you hear that, the judge was extremely angry. He felt that he'd been undermined. And, there were questions if this man is mad or if, as you suggest, there is something a lot more sinister.
I don't say that. In fact, I say quite the contrary, that the Egyptian judicial system operates on its own rules. It is not guided from Cairo. This is not a responsibility of the central government, and it will be reviewed inside the system of law. That point needs to be very clear. But there's a further implication in the remarks that we're hearing that somehow this is part of a pattern of repression in Egypt, when in fact you are seeing a return to stability in the country, and you're seeing a government that is increasingly sensitive to public opinion. It's been through 2 years of revolution, and public opinion is very, very sensitive to arbitrary government procedure. So I argue with you that you don't call this the final moment in the Minya trial. There's more that lies in front of us, and don't read into the story more than is there.
Nicholas, do you agree with that what we're actually seeing at the moment is a return to some sort of stability in Egypt, that the justice system is doing what it should be doing?
Well, I think it's very clear from the verdict that we saw that Egypt's criminal justice system is not fit for purpose. And that's not just based on this trial, but that's based on years of incompetent investigations and a selective judicial nature, which is more intent on punishing government critics and Mohamed Morsi supporters than going after the security forces for gross human rights violations. I think it's very telling that a court has been very happy to hand down over 500 death sentences for the killing of one police officer, but only one police officer is now serving a prison sentence for deaths in the latest political unrest. We have yet to see a single criminal prosecution for the deaths of over 1,400 protesters since Mohamed Morsi was ousted. I think this raises serious questions about the impartiality of Egypt's criminal justice system. Furthermore, I would say that as much as we like to talk about Egyptian government being sensitive to public opinion, I think we should bear in mind that those who are dissenting voices have been actually locked up by the Egyptian criminal justice system. They don't just include Mohamed Morsi's supporters, they also include people like blogger Ala Abdel Fattah, who is a longtime critic of the Egyptian authorities and who was only released on bail over the weekend.
Well, as you say, the Egyptian government is accused of widespread human rights abuses. More than 16,000 people have been locked up in recent months. Many are being held indefinitely, with prosecutors renewing their detention every 15 days. Human rights groups have documented cases of torture and mistreatment of those in custody, and police have been accused of using excessive force against protesters. More than 1,000 people have been killed by security forces since July. Frank, it seems that this sort of violence and human rights abuses are endemic now in the country, and that, if anything, they've got worse since Morsi was ousted.
Well, that's your statement. I would argue that Egypt has been through an extraordinary revolutionary crisis, and that if you look at a broader picture of what's going on in the country, you can't reach only that conclusion. You're giving a one-sided picture. In fact, Egypt has gone through a very important constitutional election. It will go through a presidential election. It will have parliamentary elections coming up. The country is returning to a degree of stability. You can feel it if you're in the country. I just did, experienced it, and noted what Egyptians are saying. That doesn't set aside the abuses. The abuses are there, but the picture's a broader one. And I would argue, finally, it's in all of our interests that Egypt regain her stability so that she can address issues of this nature and that she can get on and be a force for stability throughout the region. No interest we have is served by Egypt's system coming apart.
But that doesn't justify getting...
argue with it, doesn't...
Excuse me, jumping in again. It doesn't justify targeting one side, does it? I mean, for example, the thousands that were killed in Rabah Square, nobody's been brought to justice, whereas the demonstrators, those against the regime, are the ones who've gone into court. How does that work?
Well, you have to get inside the very highly stressed Egyptian situation. The Minya matter is a pattern of long-standing violence in the area, the burning of churches, the targeting of religious minorities, in addition to the attacks on the police station. That does not set aside your concerns and mine with the way the criminal justice system worked. I'm as troubled by that as you are. But what I want to be clear about is that you can't lay this problem at the feet of political authority, nor can you describe it as part of a massive system of repression, when in fact Egypt is also returning to a degree of constitutional order.
I'm delighted to be able to bring in another guest from New York, Yehia Ghanem, a newspaper editor in exile, who was sentenced to 2 years in prison in Egypt for working with a foreign NGO. So, Yehia, as a victim of the justice system in Egypt, what is your response to this latest ruling?
Well, let me start by saying that I was really appalled by the verdict that came out yesterday, and it's not actually because of the verdict, but the way it came out, and the fact that I guess it makes it good to enter the Guinness Record book in terms of the time that was given for the trial, in terms of many other facts that came out yesterday. In less than 48 hours, the verdict came out, and no evidence were sealed, no defense was heard, nothing. Actually, I was really appalled by the verdict.
What do you make of the comments by the guest, Frank Wisner? He said that what we're actually seeing in Egypt at the moment is a country returning to stability. Do you agree with that?
Well, I would hope Mr. Frank Wisner is right about this, but definitely what I'm seeing is not what I can call birth pangs of democracy. I guess the early signs of democracy or even stability shouldn't be this way. I don't believe these are signs for anything good coming up in the near future.
I mean, what we are hearing is that so many people have been rounded up, that the prisons are overcrowded. Sometimes, Nicholas, you can probably confirm this, there's something like 40 people to a cell. Yehia, tell us briefly about your experience because of your relationship to an NGO and what happened to you.
Well, actually, I don't like to get into the details of this, but I stood up in the cage for 19 months throughout the trial, and I thought for a moment, or for moments, that I was being tried by the law, but that was nowhere to be found. I guess, and according even to the verdict and the explanation that was given by the judge, the whole thing came against what happened in the courtroom. But the so-called evidence that they had were just, I'm talking about in my case, my specific case, were just a heap of newspaper flyers that they found at the office when they raided it, and some maps for AUC, the American University in Cairo maps, and that was it. And in spite of all this, the judge, in his explanation for the verdict, he said that he was convinced with the evidence that they found that incriminated me. Also the so-called evidence witnesses, and they had about 22 evidence witnesses. They all reversed their testimonies in front of the judge under the cross-examination, and the judge, in spite of that, the judge came out to say that the judge was convinced with the testimonies of the so-called witness evidence, and
I'm going to jump in here because I'd like to bring in the other guests. Forgive me, Frank. I mean, we are seeing a litany of human rights abuses in the country at the moment. What do you make of the international condemnation? I mean, it seems that it's been, if anything, muted. Why is that?
Well, I first of all don't agree with you. I don't think it's been muted. If you open up your daily papers in the United States, you will find a number of very strong condemnations. You've seen statements by governments about the judicial process in Egypt, so I think your assertion is not factual. On the other hand, I continue to come back to a central point. The picture you're painting of Egypt is a nation, the dominant reality is the abuse of human rights, the violation of normal judicial standards. And while there is much to be worried about and to condemn, that is not the whole picture in Egypt. I assert and say again that Egypt is on its way back to recovery, and that recovery is in all of our interests. For only in a course of stability will the issues that we're jointly worried about today be addressed. In a
regardless of the cost to
violence,
human rights.
It will not happen. No, I did not say that. You have attempted to put those words in my mouth, but you're not correct. The return to stability,
what is stability without human rights?
Creates stability must include human rights, but they can't all
You've
be
spoken
achieved
of
at once.
Egypt's new constitution, which enshrines...
Chaos,
Egypt's new constitution does enshrine human rights guarantees, but without rule of law, that constitution is just a piece of paper. And so I think we need to look at what's happening within Egypt's prison cells right now. One of the protesters who was arrested in January told us that the walls of their cell were covered in blood. These are people who are not being given access to their due process rights. They're not being questioned in the presence of a lawyer. They're not being given fair trials. And all that's happening is effectively summary justice. Now, I agree with you that Mohamed Morsi's supporters, some of them have committed serious human rights abuses. But surely what is needed is an independent and impartial criminal justice system that can deliver justice for all, rather than the selective system that we're seeing at the moment, where security forces are getting away with murder, but government critics are being locked up, and Mohamed Morsi's supporters are not even being given the fair trials that they should be under international law.
Nicholas, I'm going to jump in here. I want to find out what the psychological impact is of what's going on. Even if those 529 condemned to death don't go to the gallows, psychologically, what sort of impact must it have on them and their families and the country as a whole?
Well, right now, these are dead men walking. And while there will be, hopefully, an appeals process, and the lawyers have the right to appeal, and there will be, hopefully, retrials for those who are sentenced in their absentia, it delivers a huge psychological blow to know that you are effectively on death row, whether you are in the court or not, or whether you're even in prison or you're not. And while the death row prisoners really live in the shadows and there is very little information on what happens to them, whispers from human rights organizations that we've spoken to tell of terrifying ordeals in which sometimes death row inmates don't even know the date of their own execution.
Yeah, I should imagine that even in your case, though you weren't facing death, it must have been psychologically pretty crippling on you and your family.
Well, I was never in jail. I was on trial, and during the trial, you know how the Egyptian judiciary system, you stand in a cage, and that, of course, had severe psychological impacts on me and my family as well. But to tell you the truth, the impacts were more had to do more with the media frenzy that was launched against me and the rest of the defendants since day one of the trial. Even before the start of the trial, during the investigations, we were condemned and we were convicted even before the trial started by the media, which was actually influenced by the executive and the security apparatuses. And because of that, there were severe psychological impacts on me, and even physical one, because that media frenzy resulted in a public state of hate against me and my family and the other defendants as well. You can imagine what happened. You know, how does it feel when your son, I mean, 15 years old son, gets attacked in his school by his schoolmates because of that media frenzy against me, against his father, and had his both arms broken by his mates, and even in that situation, you cannot go and file a report at the police because you're branded by the media, you're branded by the state, even before the start of the trial.
Okay, let me bring Frank in.
Sorry,
excuse me interrupting you. Frank, are you not concerned about the fallout from this, considering that it's affected a tribal part of Egypt, and so many families have been affected?
Well, first of all, do understand your Egyptian history. The area around Minya in Upper Egypt has long been an area of conflict and dissidence, both religious extremism and actions taken against minorities. This is not a new story. It's deeply regrettable, but that's the nature of Egypt. Now, what's going to happen in this case, I foresee a very careful review of the Minya judge's findings. I don't know what that review will produce. I'm not going to forecast it and predict what it'll take place. But I cannot believe that 500 people are going to be executed. Strikes me as implausible. But I come back to the core point that I believe you're missing, and that is Egypt is a post-revolutionary society. It's gone through huge internal convulsions. Some things are wrong, some things are coming right. But in the end, all our interests are served by Egypt returning to stability and being able to sort out human rights abuses, press freedoms abuses, but they won't be sorted out in chaos. Now, we are seeing an overall positive direction in the country, and I stand by that.
I'm sure our journalists don't feel the same there, Frank. You know, 3 of our journalists have been detained in Egypt since December the 29th. Mohammed Fahmy, Baha Mohammed and Peter Gresta are accused of having links with a terrorist organisation and spreading false news. At a court hearing on Monday, Fahmy said a letter his family received from interim President Adli Mansour had given him hope.
He says the independence of the judiciary is an important thing, yes, but this is an expression from the presidency that we will be free, and we want to be free. We didn't do anything wrong.
Abdullah Al-Shami from Al Jazeera's Arabic channel has also been in custody for more than 6 months. Al Jazeera rejects all charges against its staff and continues to demand their immediate release. With thanks to my guests in New York, Yehia Ghanem from our London studios, Nicholas Piachaud, and also New York, Frank Wisner. And you can join in this discussion online, on Facebook and on Twitter. Let us know your thoughts. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. From me and the rest of the team, goodbye.